He checked his watch. It was just after 9 on the morning of August 17, 1944, and for 37 years the rhythms of his life had been governed by timetables, measurements, and the certainty of poured concrete. Within the stone belly of the citadel at Saint-Malo, an officer of the old Prussian school paced the narrow corridors, eyes skimming maps, fingers tracking ranges and elevations, as if numbers alone could hold back the world. Contemporary accounts reported him as Colonel Andreas von Olock. The name appears in sources with several spellings, so the precise form remains unclear. A man whose uniform and bearing announced a lifetime of service, and whose reputation had been forged in the long, grinding crucible of continental war. He had watched fortresses survive storms of shellfire before. He believed the mathematics that underpinned his walls. What happened next has been told in many versions. The image that held through contemporary reports and later recollections was stark. 10,000 gallons of incendiary gel hit the defenses, and what had been engineered to resist collapse simply melted away. That figure, reported as the scale of the assault in several accounts, and used here as the organizing fact of the event, anchored a morning that would, for many observers, come to mark a decisive shift in the relationship between technology and fortification. For days the citadel had been tested. Surrounding batteries thundered heavy-caliber rounds against its outer works. Artillery of 8-inch and larger calibers pounded the basalt, and the garrison endured thousands of shells that fractured parapets and shook windows in their frames. Infantry probes had been repelled. Inside the fortress, discipline was a habit carved into every routine. Ration lines, ammunition counts, ventilation checks. Engineers measured the thickness of concrete ceilings and the angles of embrasures with professional detachment. Calculations promised survivability, even under prolonged bombardment. Soldiers who had seen the Eastern Front and Stalingrad found in that confidence a familiar refuge. They measured risk against known phenomena. They had contingency for blast, for shrapnel, for plunging fire. They did not have a contingency for what would come through the air that morning. Shortly after the set scene, the narrator of this history would pause here to invite those who like such reconstructions to stay with the story. If military history fascinates you, consider subscribing. The week before had been a daily accounting of attrition. Artillery units, sighted beyond the city, sought to batter the citadel into submission. Shells broke masonry, they cracked stairwells, they collapsed outworks, yet the fortress held in the ways it was designed to hold. Its concrete shells bristled with firing ports. Ventilation shafts threaded to inner rooms. Supply depots were placed deep beneath the surface. Crews learned to move within the geometry of protection.
In the language of engineers, the defense was robust. In the language of men who had been in combat before, it was survivable. The commander trusted in those languages. He trusted that air attacks would continue to operate within certain recognizable categories: high-angle bombardment that shattered roofs, dive bombing that punched holes in exposed emplacements, incendiary raids whose flames licked wooden structures and were fought by water and earth. He had plans for small fires, for breaches, for power failures. He had charts that told him how long crews could rotate before collapse, how many casualties were tolerable, when to conserve ammunition for a last sally. The citadel had withstood far worse by persistence and professional skill. But that morning, the pattern changed. The sound shifted in a way that men sharpened by months of war immediately noticed. Twin-engine fighters, the high whine of propellers compressed by altitude, diving low over the seawall. They were P-38 Lightnings, American fighter bombers configured not merely as fighters, but as strike aircraft. Beneath their wings hung smooth, teardrop-shaped external tanks. The tanks looked at first glance like auxiliary fuel stores. What fell from them was not fuel meant to extend range. When those tanks struck the ground, they opened and released a thick, sticky gel that spread like oil, smearing stone and timber alike. It was an incendiary substance designed to cling to surfaces and burn with sustained intensity. For viewers unfamiliar with the term, napalm is shorthand for a class of incendiary gel developed during the war years to intensify and prolong burning. It adhered to surfaces, resisted ordinary extinguishing attempts, and burned at temperatures and durations that ordinary fieldcraft found difficult to combat. Some reports linked its origin to laboratories such as those at MIT and industrial chemists working to solve military problems. Historical accounts often attribute the weapon's development to concerted research efforts in the United States. Those at Saint-Malo encountered not a single small incendiary, but, as the accounts record, a mass application, thousands of gallons of the gel delivered in a concentrated burst across the fortress's outer works. The mechanics of the weapon's effect were deceptively simple and chillingly efficient. Because the gel clung, it did not merely ignite flammable materials exposed to air. It adhered to stone and metal, to timber and tar. When it flowed into small openings, firing slits, embrasures, the mouths of ventilation shafts, it continued to burn. Ventilation systems engineered to breathe life into underground rooms became inverted. Instead of drawing fresh air inward, they sucked smoke and flame deeper into the structure. The weapon did not pursue a line of penetration through the wall so much as it turned the air that sustained life into the vector of harm. This is where narrative and sensory detail converge.
Outside, the sky rippled with engine noise and, in short scatterings, the dull thud and spatter of tanks hitting stone. Inside, a different soundscape unfolded, coughing suppressed into ragged silence, the metallic creak of racks when men shifted position, the long, low hissing of something unseen burning. For a few moments, eyewitness recollections blend into cinematic immediacy, orange light reflecting off blackened masonry, the slow, viscous flow of gel pooling in the angles of trench and parapet, a smell that was not simply smoke, but the acrid, synthetic tang of petroleum derivatives and burning binders. Those sensory notes are not offered for sensational effect, but to convey how this weapon affected human perception and the built environment in ways that ordinary munitions did not. The tactical consequences were immediate. Where defenders had expected to rely on ventilation to clear smoke and to circulate air into inner chambers, the flows reversed. Heat and noxious fumes were drawn into refuges, making bunkers and supply rooms untenable. Metal instruments and optics, designed to withstand the shock of shelling, suffered from heat that softened solder and warped metal edges. Rubber and canvas stores charred and fused. The gel burned on water and earth. Attempts to smother flames with sand or to douse them with nearby seawater proved less effective than expected because the substance clung and continued to burn at contact points. As officers tried to measure the worsening situation, their calculations, based on blast pressure, shrapnel distribution, and line-of-sight suppression, failed to account for air made lethal. Inside the citadel, men began to succumb not primarily to shrapnel wounds, but to asphyxiation and incapacitating fumes. Contemporary reports described soldiers gagging, perhaps fainting, and being carried out, not always with surface wounds, but with faces darkened by smoke and lungs flooded by burning particulates. The sequence was not one of instantaneous extermination. It was a progressive degradation of the fortress's protective function. Where the calculus of defense had held that fortifications buy time and shelter, this new assault converted shelter into trap. The commander watched as the instruments of defense, ventilation shafts, firing slits, the geometry of defense itself, were turned into conduits of danger. The psychological blow to the leadership was severe. Here was a professional officer whose craft was built on predictability and the ability to engineer solutions. He had devoted years to understanding the physics of protection, concrete thicknesses, the right angles to deflect shell impact, the slope of a glacis to blunt an assault. Now, confronted with a weapon whose logic bypassed those assumptions, he experienced a kind of doctrinal vertigo. The rules he had relied on did not merely fail, they offered no immediate policy for mitigation. In war, there is always improvisation. There is always adaptation.
But cost and time were finite. With smoke thickening and men growing incapacitated, the calculus moved from defense to preservation. Eventually, the white flag was raised. Accounts describe the scene with a mixture of military formality and human weariness. Men emerging with hands empty or carrying what they could. Columns of prisoners marched out past ruined embrasures, and their commander, uniforms still neatly pressed, bearing the demeanor of a professional officer, walking into captivity with a measured, if wounded, dignity. Of roughly 3,000 men reported to have been garrisoned in the complex, contemporary sources suggested that only a fraction left walking under their own power. Some accounts cite approximately 605 survivors who were able to march out, though numbers vary and must be treated as approximate. These figures are presented as recorded in reports and recollections. They are not offered here as definitive census, but as a reflection of the scale of collapse described in available sources. Material evidence reinforced what the survivors testified to. Inspectors and engineers who entered the positions in the aftermath found blackened firing slits, surfaces where paint and structural finishes had been carbonized, equipment that showed signs of heat-induced deformation. Concrete that had been merely scarred by shellfire now bore a different signature. Surfaces baked, boundaries blackened, the geometry of the fortification altered not by fracture, but by the prolonged application of heat. These were not merely aesthetic changes. They spoke to a weapon that changed how defenders could expect their fortifications to perform. Wider reflection followed quickly. military thinkers noted that weapons which could render shelters and bunkers ineffective did more than cause localized surrender. They forced a doctrinal reassessment. The incident at Saint-Malo, as the accounts suggest, became an illustrative case in the wider narrative of 19th and 20th century military transformation. The old maxim that fortifications favored the defender had been true in an earlier technological context, but industrialization, the ability to produce new weapons at scale, to put scientific research into mass production and platform integration, altered the balance. Aircraft carrying new ordnance could deliver effects that bypassed conventional approaches to defense. Science and industry, coupled with tactical innovation, could make static lines vulnerable in a way that no amount of concrete could entirely negate. This was not the end of engineering, it was a redefinition of its terms. Fortification doctrine did not vanish overnight, nor did the value of well-constructed defensive works disappear from military reasoning. But the Saint-Malo episode made plain that static defenses required integration with mobility, with air control, with the capacity to neutralize or deter new weapons.
Designers and commanders had to think in systems: air defense, control of sea approaches, dispersion of critical stores, redundancy of ventilation and filtration, elements that, taken together, could mitigate some of the new risks. The story of the Citadel thus functioned as a case study, where the old mathematics of protection met the new chemistry of applied flame. Doctrine had to evolve. There is a moral and historical caution woven into this analysis. The application of incendiary gels and similar technologies had consequences that went beyond military calculation. The capacity to produce weapons in large quantities, to apply laboratory outputs on a battlefield scale, raised questions about the human costs of industrialized warfare. Those costs were borne by soldiers and civilians alike. In telling this story, historical restraint is important. The aim is to explain and understand, not to sensationalize suffering. Descriptions of the effects focus on systemic impact and tactical outcomes rather than on lurid detail. It is also important to frame certain claims with humility. The exact quantity of incendiary gel used that day is reported in some contemporary and later accounts as 10,000 gallons. That figure, which has become central to how the attack is remembered and which anchors this narrative, should be treated as reported rather than as an incontrovertible, independently verified fact. Similarly, the name of the commander appears with variant spellings in wartime records and recollections. The form presented here aligns with some sources, but acknowledges that historical documentation varies. References to development origins, the association of napalm-like substances with laboratories such as those at MIT, are reported in accounts and reflect the documented role of wartime research programs, yet they are best presented as part of the larger picture of industrialized weapons development. Viewed from a broader perspective, the fall of the Citadel at Saint-Malo fits into a larger arc of the Second World War. The acceleration of scientific expertise into forms of mass application, the extension of industrial output into theaters of combat, and the increasingly decisive role of logistics and technology in shaping outcomes. Individual valor and tactical ingenuity remained vital, but strategy increasingly hinged on networks of production, supply, and innovation. Weapons that could be produced at scale and integrated into aerial platforms altered the relative value of fixed positions. Fortress doctrine, once the anchor of static defense, had to make room for mobility and technological countermeasures. The human dimension of this transformation should not be lost. The commander who surrendered did so not because his men lacked courage, but because the tools he had were no longer sufficient against a weapon that worked by turning the environment against its occupants. The soldiers who marched out bore the marks of a battle in which protection became peril. Their experience is part of the story of adaptation in wartime, of how militaries and societies must reevaluate their assumptions in the face of new capacities for destruction. In the aftermath, as the town and citadel were assessed, military thinkers recorded lessons. Engineers refined designs. Logisticians argued for dispersal and redundancy. Aviators took note of the tactical possibilities of integrating incendiaries with fighter bomber operations. The event at Saint-Malo was widely read as emblematic, perhaps symbolic, of a turning point in 19th and 20th century military thought. The moment when industrialized chemistry, carried on wings, could negate centuries of fortification practice. To close, the image that persisted in reports and in the retelling is both concrete and allegorical. A fortress of stone, built to outlast shells and time, facing an invisible enemy delivered from the sky,
that clung to its angles and turned its breath into a weapon. 10,000 gallons, as the story records, became a shorthand for a new scale of applied force that measured not only in tonnage but in doctrinal consequence. What mattered in the long sweep of history was not only the immediate surrender, but the lesson it taught whole armies and theorists. The design of defense must be dynamic in a world where invention can so quickly alter the rules. Had you heard of napalm's use in Europe before? Tell us where you're watching from and share your thoughts below. If you want more stories about overlooked innovations and crucial turning points in military history, check out our other episodes.